class, welcome back to Pauline Theology and Missions. I hope you're doing well today. In our last PowerPoint, we looked at the second missionary journey and we looked at what the scripture said in regards to what Paul did on that journey. And today we're going to be looking at the third missionary journey, and we'll be looking at the locations and cities that he travels to. Some of these we've already discussed in previous PowerPoints, so I won't spend a lot of time on those. I'll just mention them. But some new locations, we will go into some more detail. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're now going to move into the PowerPoint portion of this lecture on Paul's third missionary journey, part 1, where we will be looking at the locations and cities that Paul and his team moved through. We find this in Acts 18:23 to Acts 21:18. And this is the third missionary journey narrative. And again, like we did with the other videos, if you want to pause the video now and then read this, you can, or you can continue just watching the video, but just remember it's part of your weekly reading for this week. This is the same map I've had up on the other journeys, just showing Paul's area that he is going to be working in, everywhere from Palestine over by Jerusalem on the bottom right, all the way up to Rome, where he is going to end up dying. And this is the map of the third missionary journey that you see on the screen. He starts here in Antioch, again, his base, his home sending church that sends him out on the missions, and goes over land across the southern portion of Asia Minor to Ephesus, and then he moves up, crosses over to Europe or Macedonia area, travels around in Greece, and then returns back by sea, and finally back to Tyre, and then back to here to Jerusalem, where he ends the third missionary journey. So we'll be looking at some of these cities here and following along on the map as we continue on. So, so the approach of this third missionary journey, some of these cities we've already looked at in the first and second journey. I'm not going to rehash all of that because we already had our details of those cities. But we see here that he leaves Antioch in Acts 18:24. So we see that he is in Antioch, Syria, in Acts 18:23, and then in 18:23 to 24 he leaves. He departed and went over the region of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in scriptures, came to Ephesus. So we see that Paul has now left Antioch. Over here on the map you see the red line coming out of our circle, and he follows along in Galatia, Phrygia. That's the green line here. He follows along into there, and he ends up coming to Ephesus. And we see that in Acts 18:24. It begins the Ephesus narrative, where Paul actually arrives in Ephesus in 19 verse 1, and it happened while Apollos was at Corinth that Paul, having passed through the upper regions, came to Ephesus. So we see that Paul has now moved to the city of Ephesus, where he had stopped by on the return trip from his second missionary journey. And in that PowerPoint lecture I did not spend a lot of time on Ephesus, because we'll spend more time here in Ephesus, because that's what Paul does. He spends some time there ministering to the people. So some facts about Ephesus. It's a port city and a great commercial center for the area. There's approximately 250,000 people in Ephesus, so quite a large city. It's definitely one of the largest cities in Asia Minor, and it is the seat of the Roman government in Asia Minor. So this is a major area, a major city. Many people, a lot of culture, a lot of trade, a lot of government business, a lot of people coming and going in the city of Ephesus. And what comes with that is obviously worshiping of the false god. And in Ephesus, the goddess that was mainly focused on in the city was Artemis. And there's the great temple of Artemis, which is was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And Artemis was the goddess of the hunt and of childbirth. And so there's a statue of Artemis there on the screen. And so this is going to be a culture that is pagan, worshiping false gods, worshiping the Greek and the Roman gods. And we see the focus of this city is Artemis. On the left is a recreation of the Temple of Artemis, which is actually in Istanbul, but this is just a model of what it would have looked like. Obviously not to scale. You see the size of those pine trees there in front of it. So this is just a model of the great temple to Artemis. but on the right is the actual place in Ephesus, and this is what is left of the great temple of Artemis today. So it's just barely some ruins left of this great temple that they would go and worship the false god of the hunt and childbirth. So that's enough for Ephesus, just to give you an idea of where it was and what it was about, and their focus on false god worship. But then we see that Paul leaves Ephesus and moves on to Greece. So he's in Ephesus for quite some time, chapter 19 in the book of Acts, and then we get to chapter 20. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. Now, when he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece. And so on the map here, I have my lines drawn, which is a little messy, but just follow along with the red arrow. Comes over to Macedonia, and then he moves down here into Greece, and then moves back up into Macedonia and returns to Troas. Now, in Greece, it's not given much detail about the actual locations that Paul is at in Greece. Luke just basically says that he was in Greece, and he moved around, and he had some fellow workers with him, and which is in verse 4, which I'll read that later when we start looking at the message of his third journey. But then we get to verse 6. So basically, he arrives in Greece in verse 2, and in verse 6, he sails away and goes to Troas. So not much is given for what he did in Greece and Macedonia. Obviously, he ministered. He was preaching and teaching. In verse 3, it says he was there for 3 months, so he obviously moved around, meeting with the Christians and with the churches. But then we get to verse 6, and it says that he went to Troas, where he stayed 7 days. So again, the journey is moving along. He gets to Troas. We already talked about Troas when we looked at the Macedonian call and when we looked at the second missionary journey. So I'm not going to rehash any of that, but he's now in Troas. After the 7 days in Troas, he moves on, and we get to verse 13 of Acts 20, and it says, "Then he went ahead to the ship and sailed to Assos, and there, intending to take Paul on board, for so he had given orders, intending himself to go on foot. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and came to Mytilene. We sailed from there, and the next day came opposite Chios. The following day we arrived at Samos and stayed at Trogyllium. The next day we came to Miletus." So we see here in those couple of verses that I read, Luke is writing about how they went to the city of Assos and Paul went on foot, and so they were going to meet up with him, and they do. And so we see a couple of locations there: Assos, Mytilene, Samos, and Trogyllium. And really, there's not any kind of explanation of ministering there. It's more about that they just stopped there for the night. Verse 15, we sailed from there, and the next day came to opposite of Chios. The following day, we arrived at Samos and stayed Trogyllium. The next day, we came to Miletus. And so when you see these words of they just stayed there for the day, well, really what they were doing is they were staying overnight to have a place to stay, a place to sleep, not traveling on the road at night or not traveling by sea at night, and then they would leave the next day. So really not much is going on in these couple of cities, but Luke gives it to us here in the book of Acts. Again, a very accurate historian, so he's saying exactly where they were as they travel on the journey. So there on the screen, I just changed the maps to show you where we are now on the journey. So we went from Troas to Assos to Mytilene, and then to Samos, and then to Miletus. So in Miletus, he does stay for just a little bit. It says in verse 17 of Acts 20, "From Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called for the elders of the church, and when they had come to him, he said to them," and then we see a narrative that he speaks to them. Well, he is actually staying in Miletus for a short time to meet with these elders of Ephesus who travel from Ephesus to Miletus, which is not a very long journey for them. So the elders come to him now in Miletus, and it's a small city. It had 3 ports, so it's right there on the ocean, and it was a good place to catch a ship back to Jerusalem. And like I said, in the other missionary journeys, especially the first journey, the southern portion of Asia Minor, there were some large ports and a lot of shipping was going on. So catching a boat from Miletus and traveling across the sea to Palestine to get to Jerusalem was not uncommon. So this was a place that he could get a boat. And like I said, that's where he called the elders of Ephesus to come and see him. And there's a ruin there in Miletus. That's the amphitheater. And this is kind of like a cross-section of the amphitheater there in Miletus. On the right-hand side is obviously the seating area, and on the left is an arched entryway, tunnel, and the side wall of the amphitheater, which basically that would have been filled with earth, and they would have built it up to be able to have a good place for people to sit to hear a speech with obviously no kind of sound projection equipment. They would basically be able to stand there at the on the stage at the base of the amphitheater and speak, and all of the people would be able to hear because of the way it was designed. So that was at Miletus, and then from there we see that they leave, and we get to verse 1 and 2 of chapter 21. So after they leave there, they move through a couple of areas pretty quickly. They go to Kos, Rhodes, Patara, and Tyre. And you can see that on the map with the red line that has gone now for the journey. And Kos is a small island. It's only 5 miles from the coast of Asia Minor, kind of opposite of Miletus. And the big thing for Kos is that it is known for Hippocrates' School of Medicine was located on this small island. So if we think about Hippocrates, he's the one that created the Hippocratic Oath that doctors would swear to provide good medical attention to their patients. Now, the actual Hippocratic Oath, the original one, had them dedicating their practices to the gods and all of that. But the modern Hippocratic Oath is what modern doctors are supposed to swear to give ethical treatment to patients. But this is where Hippocrates' School of Medicine was located. And then we get to the island of Rhodes. Now, this is a fairly large island. And when one came to the main port on Rhodes, they would be welcomed by the 108-foot high statue of Colossus. And now this is a massive statue for the time, being 108 feet tall. That's almost 11 stories tall. And this was also one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It does not exist today, but this was one of the wonders. And there's just an artistic representation of boats or little ships coming into the harbor, and you have Colossus there standing above them. So that's the island of Rhodes. Then they leave there and go to Patara, and we see all of this in verse 1 of Acts 21. Just a brief description there that they went a straight course. We came to Kos, and then following day to Rhodes, and from there we went to Patara, and finding a ship sailed over to Phoenicia. So you can see on the map that they cross quite a bit of ocean of the Mediterranean Sea and then arrive in the region of Phoenicia. So after they went to Patara, which was a main stop for Alexandrian grain ships, which Alexandria is in northern Egypt. So down here they would have crossed from Alexandria and gone up here to Patara. That's the grain ships, what they would have done. So they leave Patara and they catch a ride and they come to Phoenicia. And what they do is they come to the city of Tyre. Now, Tyre is a coastal city in the Phoenician region, and it was controlled by the governor of Syria. So even though we're getting closer and closer to Palestine, it's still very heavily Roman and controlled by the governor of Syria. Then they leave there and they get to Ptolemais. Now, Ptolemais we see in chapter 21, verse 7. And when we had finished our voyage from Tyre, we came to Ptolemais, greeted the brethren, and stayed with them one day. So they're in Ptolemais. Now, Ptolemais is actually the city of Akko, which is in Judges 131, which says, "Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko or the inhabitants of Sidon." Now, Paul has arrived here in this very old city of Ptolemais. They don't stay very long. Now, Ptolemais was actually renamed by Ptolemy II, who was 282 to 246 BC, being Greek, and he named that city after himself. So the Gentiles did control that city, and it was known that the Gentiles of Ptolemais did not accept the Jews, even came to hate the Jews. And then they leave there and they go to Caesarea. We see that in Acts 21:8. On the next day, we who were Paul's companions departed and came to Caesarea and entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. So they go to Caesarea. Now, this is a major port city that's in the region of Palestine, and it has approximately 50,000 people. It was constructed, quote-unquote, more recently by Herod the Great, who was the ruler of the area when Jesus was born. So the city was not very old, but still quite a large city for being a newer city. It was the seat of the Roman government in Judea, so a lot of Roman officials would be there. A lot of business would have taken place there in regards to Rome. Now, there was numerous religions that were practiced in the city of Caesarea. Again, it's a port city, so a lot of coming and going. But we see a couple of the gods there that were worshipped. We have Tyche, or also known as Fortuna, which is the goddess of fortune and luck. We have Ephesian Artemis, which is also known as Diana, and she's the goddess of childbirth. There was Apollo, who is the god of oracles, healing, sunlight, and the flocks. And also Apollo had a lot of other areas of responsibility, but these are the main ones. There was Mithras, who is the god of the sun. And then there was the ruler cult focused there in Caesarea, which is the worship of Augustus, or whatever Caesar would have been on the throne in Rome. They would have worshipped the Caesar, and Caesarea was a focus point or focus city for the worship of the emperor. And then, of course, Judaism is found there. And as we just read, what did they do when the team showed up in Caesarea? They met the brethren there. So we have a Christian element also in Caesarea, where they says they stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist. So we do have a Christian element in Caesarea also. And then here's a picture of the ruins of Caesarea right here on the coast. I mean, just a beautiful Mediterranean Sea coming right up to where Caesarea is. So you can just imagine the team bring a ship coming into the harbor, and they unload and they move in and meet up with Philip the evangelist. And they stayed with him. So just a nice little area there, and just an up-close picture of the ruins. So right here is actually a racetrack, this kind of long oval area, and then this is the zoom in on that racetrack, so you can see the seats here, and then this is where the chariots would have raced around on the track. And then here's just another angle from it, and here's that amphitheater sitting back here. It looks like it's been refurbished or reconstructed back there, but you can see some sort of a welcoming kind of a colonnade right in here, a place that people can walk. And you can see obviously tourists all walking down on here. And then after that, they leave Caesarea and they come to Jerusalem, where it says in Acts 21:15, and after those days we packed and went up to Jerusalem. Also some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, and brought with them a certain Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple, with whom we were to lodge. So they come to Jerusalem, and we're not going to talk about the history of Jerusalem or what takes place there. We know obviously from the New Testament and the Gospels what takes place in Jerusalem. So all I did was just put up a picture there of a wall that is in Jerusalem today, and we'll just end the missionary journey there with the focus of location of the cities. Okay, so that's it for this PowerPoint. I'll see you in a second. All right, class, that's it for today. Next time, we'll be looking at the message of the third missionary journey and exegete the passage in the book of Acts. I'll see you then.